Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lux Research webinar. My name is Mike Holman, SVP here at Lux, moderating today's session, where we will be talking about the UN's plastic treaty. As many of you, as you probably know, if you're on this call, the UN recently wrapped up what was meant to be the final negotiating sessions around a global plastics treaty. Did they succeed in concluding it? What did they decide, and what will the impact of that be on the industry? That is what we are going to discuss today with our presenters, Anthony Schiavo, who's the Senior Director and Principal Analyst at Lux, and Martian Lee, who's an analyst and one of our top experts in plastic recycling. And so they'll be taking us through all that. Throughout the webinar, you can enter if you have any questions, you can put those into the Q&A box. We will collect those and have some time for Q&A at the end. We'll answer as many as we can, or follow up with you if we don't get a chance to get to you. If you like, or if you think of a great question afterwards, you can also email questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we'll get back to you. Hopefully everything will go off smoothly without any technical difficulties, but if any of you are experiencing if you see a frozen screen, often if you just refresh your browser and of course check your internet connection, that will often fix any of the issues. So without any further delay, let's jump into the presentation with Anthony and Martian.
Thanks, Mike, for that introduction, and thanks, Martian, for joining me today. Yeah, and we're really excited to talk about this. This is the moment 2 years ago now, in March of 2022, when the UN Environment Assembly adopted a binding resolution to create a treaty to end plastic pollution. And I actually watched this happen live. I woke up at around 5:30 in the morning to actually catch this. And it's been kind of a wild 2 years since then. So we're going to first go over the landscape of where things stood kind of coming into this most recent session. Then we'll actually dig into what happened at INC5 and what the outcomes were. And we'll then look at what does this mean for the plastics industry? Where are we headed currently? Will this treaty transform the industry, and to what extent? So first, it's good to start with a bit of a timeline. So I mentioned in 2022, the resolution was signed. There have been 4 meetings so far, INC 1, 2, 3, and 4. In December, we had the first INC meeting. And in June 2023, we had the second meeting, INC 2. And I think it's worth noting that at this point, we had the 0 draft. So this was like a very, very initial draft of all the potential options for the treaty. But we also were definitely beginning to see some cracks show in the process. At this point, the procedural elements of how the treaty was going to be negotiated were supposed to have been hammered out, ideally by the end of the first meeting, but certainly by the end of the second meeting. But in reality, those procedural issues were not resolved or anywhere even really close to resolved by the end of INC 2. And in fact, we didn't really get a lot of procedural clarity until INC 4. So, from the start, there's been a very challenging set of procedural issues because the member countries have had very different ideas about what they should be doing here. And we've continued to refine the draft, but as Mike mentioned, this final meeting, INC 5 in Busan, South Korea, which just wrapped up earlier this week, was supposed to be the deadline for ratification. So we were supposed to get a treaty at the end of this week. And that's very, very fast for the UN, right? 2 years. It's may seem like a long time, but for the UN, it's really lightning quick. I think it's also important to call out things are kind of different now. 2022 was really this high watermark for government sustainability, right? You had COP26, which was this really well-attended, high-level, high-profile event where world leaders came together and kind of tried to renew their commitment to climate change. 6 months later, you had the Biden administration signing the Inflation Reduction Act into law, really setting off a wave of substantial government intervention and government support for clean technologies. And it really seemed like a new era of industrial policy, right? Fast forward 2 years to now, there's been a distinct vibe shift, I think it's fair to say. A lot of those world leaders who were at the March 2022, or excuse me, at the COP26, or whose delegates were at the March 2022 UN meeting, have been swept out of power, right? As voters have sort of punished them for maybe for inflation or for other issues, right? A lot of the green technologies that were the focus of the scale-up efforts, it's not been as easy as people thought, right? Prices have been still high for things like green hydrogen. And of course, in the United States, we have the return of Donald Trump, who is, among other things, famous for pulling the United States out of the Paris Accords. So someone who's very, very skeptical of the type of international cooperation that the whole UN process is based on. So it's really become, I think, a much more challenging environment for these types of agreements. Still, going into the session, there was some cause for hope, for momentum. The Biden administration had been signaling that it was moving closer to the High Ambition Coalition, which is a group of about 80 countries who want a expansive, impactful treaty, including things like production caps on plastics, strong regulations on form factors and plastics of concern, and other stronger elements, more internationally defined than nationally defined elements. And the Biden administration had been getting more tough on plastic waste at home as well. So there was reason to think that this could sort of move in a more positive direction. In addition, there's growing corporate support for a stronger treaty, right? The Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty is a group that wants a more ambitious and more global treaty. So including production caps, including stronger limits on form factors, and more action on eliminating waste in the environment, right? And I think the goal of these group of corporations is really to have a globally consistent set of regulations, right? They want to be able to use the same technologies and designs and form factors everywhere, and they want to avoid a very fragmented landscape. Now, this group of corporations includes a lot of packaging companies, as you might expect. They would really benefit from that consistent sort of landscape. Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, but it also includes companies in the plastics value chain, very global, Henkel, right? So I think there's a bit of a media narrative around the corporate presence at these meetings being entirely evil, big oil, right? But I think the reality is a lot more nuanced than that. However, although there were some signs of momentum, I think it's fair to say that going into INC 5, we were very, very far from a final agreement. And a good example of this is on Article 6. This is the article that would cover supply and those production caps. And in the non-paper, which is kind of a strange name, but essentially a chairman's draft leading into the committee, the chairman declined to even propose a text for this article, which really shows how far away from consensus the delegates really were. So, leading into INC 5, some positive signs of momentum, a lot of big challenges. Martian, I think everyone probably knows already, but what happened? Did we get a legally, globally binding treaty on plastic waste in the environment?
Yeah, Anthony, I think your slide pretty much said it all. We did not get an agreement. Although there are some more controversial policies and proposals that got the support of over 100 countries, unfortunately, a simple majority is not enough to push some of these policies through, especially not on the international stage like the UN. Yeah.
So, no, we did not get an agreement. And I think what Martian hinted at is the issue of production caps. So the Panama delegation proposed this Article 6 text. Conference of Parties shall adopt a global target to reduce the production of plastic polymers and, not just reduce it to the sustainable levels, right? That's the language here. And like you said, Martian, this got the support of over 100 countries. Importantly, not the United States. So the Biden administration actually backed off its stronger stance, it seems like. But what would the impact of this be, or why is this so controversial, and where is sort of the debate coming from?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the biggest there are 2 points to make here, and I think that the biggest problem here is really the language. If we were to adopt the Article 6 as proposed by Panama, this pretty much gives the UN the power to impose a blanket reduction in plastic production, regardless the socioeconomic factors that your own individual country is experiencing, right? And I think there's going to be a very disproportionate impact on countries that are very big on the plastics value chain and those who are not. So let me give you an example. I'm from Singapore. We are a huge petrochemical refining country. And if we were to compare the market size of our plastics exports, right, with a country like Zambia, which is one of the supporters of this proposal, our market size for plastics is 1,000 times greater than Zambia, right? And so if we were to pass a proposal like that, Singapore and countries like Singapore will experience impacts that are literally 1,000 times harsher than countries that are not in the plastics value chain.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's no surprise that this was strongly opposed by countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, major oil and gas and plastics producers. And I think in addition, there's a question really of scope here, right? So, this is the quote from Juan Carlos Monterrey Gomez, one of the lead negotiators from Panama. He said, the momentum is with this coalition supporting the caps, even if the challenges are still daunting. But I think the rebut to that is really that the problem is pollution, not the plastics. This is from the Saudi Arabian negotiator. And there's still this fundamental disagreement, really even around the scope of the treaty, right? Is it even permissible for these countries to impose these types of caps, in part because of the language, in part because of the disparate impact that you discussed, right? I think the rebut to that from the other small countries is that, the impacts of waste themselves are highly disparate, right? Especially for the small developing island nations. They have potential waste impacts from ocean plastics that are much, much greater than the scope of their population or their economy, which again might be really small. So it's challenging to manage these different factors, and we're really seeing that in negotiations. I think you also see this kind of challenge here in the chemicals of concern, because this is an area where, chemicals of concern, plastics of concern have been part of the treaty since the beginning. And I think at the beginning of the treaty, they were somewhat less controversial. Everyone kind of agreed that these plastics of concern needed to be phased out, or that materials of concern needed to be phased out. But again, as we're getting more into these definitions, the cracks are really beginning to show. So for example, the EU proposed text that, basically included any single-use plastic or plastic that's likely to be littered in its criteria for concern, which is a really sweeping definition, right? And you compare that to Russia, where they didn't even basically define a list. They said every single nation should choose a list for themselves, right? So much more aligned with the issue of national sovereignty, but also really setting a much lower standard for what constitutes concern. And there's a wide range in between. Some countries, really focusing more on chemical additives, and some, bringing elements of design in here. Martian, how are you thinking about chemicals of concern? This is an area that again, there looked like there was some agreement earlier on in the process. Now it seems more divisive. Do you think that it's still possible to get something like this into the final text of the agreement?
Yeah, I think the challenge here really is there's this struggle between equality and equity, right?
Mm.
Where from the EU side of things, they're looking for something that's more homogenized, where there's this agreed set of chemicals or plastic products that we want to regulate, and the entire globe just follows the same set of standards. But then on the other hand, you have the other camp like Russia, which is trying to keep these types of regulations a national prerogative. And I think the most important bit to highlight here really is that they want it to be based on national circumstances and capabilities, right? And this is the same thing with the plastic production caps, where there is this disregard for national circumstances, and that's why it's very hard to get international agreement, especially when different countries have different considerations when it comes to these matters.
Yeah, and of course there is some consideration of that in the EU proposal, right? We can't display the full text here, but it's clearly a question of, what are you prioritizing, right? Are you prioritizing, defining a list, right, that needs to include these things that are likely to be littered, and you can define that, or, giving free rein to the countries to identify whatever they think is or isn't a chemical of concern. And a similar thing here, EPR. I think EPR, extended producer responsibility, which is a type of regulatory framework designed to manage waste, right? Typically, the polluter pays is part of this concept. The EU again is really pushing for a EPR scheme to have guidelines and design requirements that are defined at an international level, right? So that EPR schemes include certain types of features or don't have certain types of structures, right? And they actually want to make EPR a separate article. The EU is actually pushing for a whole separate article on EPR. So really prioritizing this. I think we're still positive on EPR, or, looking back at INC4, we talked about that. We said EPR is really emerging as a consensus. But do you think it's likely to get this type of guidelines on EPR, or do you think it's more likely that the countries will develop their own EPR schemes?
Yeah, I think there shouldn't be too much pushback from having an article on EPR, right? If we look at global trends with EPR schemes, even without this UN Plastics Treaty, EPR is gaining momentum all over the world. It's not just in the West, but countries in the APEC region like Malaysia, Indonesia, India, they've all started to consider EPR and start to develop schemes for EPR. So left to their own devices, I am pretty sure that majority of the world will eventually get on board with extended producer responsibility. Now, with this article on EPR that the EU is pushing for, they have quite explicitly said that it's not going to be prescriptive. It's going to be more of a guideline. And when there's this flexibility built into this article itself, I think it is a lot easier to get agreement and to get the rest of the world to agree to this article.
Yeah, and I think also in terms of getting those, just getting a deal signed, it's a lot easier to push some of those down into the further negotiating committees after the deal is signed. But one interesting thing that is maybe a bit stronger, or is momentum towards a stronger treaty, I should say, is that we did see a lot of support for plastic fees, or I should say growing support for plastic fees. And I think partly this is due to the fact that before the meeting, there was a report that was published as part of the research for the session, really showing that EPR fees or EPR schemes by themselves would not really be sufficient in order to fund the investment, especially the investment into the developing economies who have weaker waste supply systems overall, waste management systems. So these would be fees on the producers of plastics, right, that would ultimately be paid out to the countries that are not producing plastics. So this is, something where we see more momentum compared to last session. And indeed, a number of Australia, Canada, EU, a number of other, Japan, all supported this. Is this likely, or what are you thinking about in terms of these plastic fees?
Yeah, I think this is very important, because when we want to implement drastic changes to the value chain, the question about who's paying for it always pops up, right? And this article addresses just that. And previously when we're talking, I've been talking about equality versus equity. Right now, this article is pushing for equity, because the countries, the producers that are benefiting the most from plastic production, the countries that are contributing the most to the plastic pollution problem now are required to fund the changes that we want to deal with plastic waste. And I think this is a fair way to get funding for these changes to happen.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because there's a comparison here between this and the CO2 carbon emissions funding, but I think this is actually a lot more viable. And I don't think, I think there's an instinct maybe to look at the challenges with CO2 funding and sort of write this off. But plastic production is a lot more concentrated, and it's a lot more directly attached to a profit-making exercise. Right? So there's definitely an opportunity here to actually try and get some of these fees. Of course, the resistance is going to be really strong. So it really remains to be seen what's actually possible. But I actually think this is more likely than, or more potentially impactful than some of those CO2-based mechanisms. And lastly, I think we were looking out for issues around chemical recycling, around bio-based plastics, around design. I think these other issues, they kind of really took a back seat. Maybe design was sort of highest among these, but I'm curious for your take, but I didn't really see a lot of activity around chemical recycling or bio-based plastics. And I think that, bio-based plastics in particular seems to be really slept on, if you will, not part of this discussion. So what's going on there?
Yeah, I agree with you, Anthony. I did not really see any talk about bio-based plastics, especially biodegradables. Perhaps there was some mention about rejecting oxo-degradables, but not really the biodegradable side of things. And I think this is going to be a potential issue, especially when we don't talk about definitions of recycling. That is because there is now a level of agreement that plastic products have to be designed to be reusable, repairable, and recyclable, right? Then the next question will be, if something is recyclable through mechanical recycling, if something is not recyclable through mechanical recycling, but it can be recycled through a chemical approach, do we define that? Do we accept that as being designed for recyclability, right? But unfortunately, I think at this point in time, I don't think that chemical recycling would be regulated on an international level. Most likely, it's still going to be down to the national governments who will be deciding for themselves whether it's going to be acceptable or not.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, looking forward, this is a quote from the chair, Luis Valles Valdivieso. He said, "Walker, there is no path. The path is made by walking." Well, it seems like there's a lot more walking left to do. And there's a lot of uncertainty now, right? The group has agreed to a INC 5.2, basically an additional meeting. But the exact nature of that meeting's up in the air. We don't know the timing. We don't know the location yet. So there's really still a huge amount of uncertainty. And for me, I think at least there's now more of a chance for the first time that we won't get any agreement at all, right? And I think, there's a lot of also challenges. Will these agreements be ratified if we actually get an agreement, right? Trump has, prepared to withdraw us from the Paris Accords again. The Stockholm Convention, the U.S. Signed but never ratified it, I believe, or possibly ratified but never signed. But, we're still not a party to that. And so I think it's challenging to know or to imagine a very high degree of impact from this agreement going forward. But I think we still think the likely case is some adoption of a treaty. Some treaty will emerge from this, right? But it's likely to be a lower ambition treaty, right? And I think we'll see the biggest sort of impacts be national level adoption of EPR schemes. That will take time, right? But that, like you said, I think there's already momentum for that, and I think we'll see that continue. I think we'll see the more, hopefully, phase out of problematic waste disposal techniques. So there'll be more pressure on things like open burning. There'll be more pressure on incineration, potentially more pressure on landfilling as well. And so countries will be under pressure to stop that type of thing. They'll be under pressure to invest more in their waste management ecosystems. And hopefully, and maybe this is a little bit less likely, we could get more harmonized global definitions of waste and recycling. But I think there's a real risk that we end up with schemes, EPR schemes, that vary pretty differently in terms of what they require of companies, even if we do get more international harmonization here. Anything you would call out on this slide, Martian?
Yeah, I do agree with you that it is likely they will end up with a low ambition treaty. It's going to be a very watered down version of what we have been talking about so far. There'll be plenty of caveats for voluntary adoption. There is going to be plenty of caveats for flexibility depending on an individual country's economic status and capabilities, right? I would agree with you that EPR schemes are likely to be adopted on a global scale, and pretty much this. I don't think that is going to be very meaningful changes within the near term. This low ambition treaty is going to get us kind of. It'll kind of be the starting point, right, where we start to build more bigger changes, more impactful requirements. Only after we've adopted a low emission treaty as a starting line.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you put together this great example where if you look at the Montreal Protocol, right, which is the protocol designed to address the ozone layer, holes in the ozone layer, it took a long time, even though this is probably the most successful international treaty in terms of its impacts, at least in terms of the sustainability-focused treaties, right? It still took about 25 years from that first being signed till the healing of the ozone layer really kicked off. And, again, it took like more than a decade for developing economies to really begin to implement from the time it was signed. And I think you'll see probably a similar trajectory here with this, where, even if we get something this year or in 2025, I guess I should say, it'll still probably be 5 to 10 years before countries, these developing economies really begin to implement EPR and these more intensive waste management techniques. So I think fragmentation is really the word of the day, right? Where recycling policy is likely to end up in a more fragmented place as a result of this treaty, and really as a result of this failure of treaty. And this will have important effects on the plastics industry, but it's not going to be the hugely transformative document that I think some of its authors are really hoping for. Well, a few key takeaways to keep in mind, right? One, I think the whole treaty is at risk, right, in a way that it wasn't before. The failure to really get anything done, or the failure to really bridge these key divides at INC 5 with the pressure of the clock ticking, really highlights how challenging the negotiation is. I think we still think that a low emission treaty is the most likely outcome, even though now more than 100 countries support things like plastic caps. That momentum is probably not going to be able to break through the barriers. And one possible scenario is we get a treaty, it's a low emission treaty, and then actors like the US and Iran and Russia and Saudi Arabia don't accept the treaty, right? And you end up in a situation where you have an even more intensive sort of patchwork of regulations, where some countries are party to this international treaty, some countries are not, and that could affect things like international plastic trade, right? We see that, with some of the international waste shipping, right, already happening, where the fact that the U.S. is not party to certain international treaties has an impact there already. So before we get into the Q&A, what can you actually do about this? Well, the good news is that there's still time to get active in shaping the treaty, right? There's still going to be another meeting. maybe hopefully not 2 more meetings, but possibly a year or so of negotiations, right? At least 6 more months of negotiations. So there's still time to get there's still time to get involved in things like the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty. I think there's going to be necessarily a lot more waste infrastructure development in these developing economies, right? So investing in the technologies and building a plan for that is really crucial. We've seen, like in India, for example, the software for waste tracking has had a lot more momentum, right? Because there's a lot more small actors and a lot more fragmentation in that waste market. So there's a different type of set of technologies that are necessary for things like these developing waste economies, right? You should focus on a national level, though, right? If you just have a global strategy for waste plastics, I think that's missing the mark. You really need to understand that the EU, the US, these developing economies, Japan, China, they're all going to have different waste ecosystems, right? And different waste regulations. And also technologies that can operate under a wider range of regulatory schemes are going to be favored. So something like pyrolysis, where, you really benefit from mass balance, you really benefit from these specific definitions. I think that's more challenging to operate in this type of environment because you're going to have more fragmentation. Even if countries, even if every country accepts pyrolysis, if they all have a different definition of how mass balancing needs to get done, for example, that's still challenging, right? So fragmentation, I think, makes certain technologies, things like mechanical recycling or maybe even PET depolymerization, a little bit more easy to accomplish compared to something like plastic pyrolysis. So with that, we want to say thanks. You can look forward to some of our upcoming webinars, and you can check out our website for more. We write a lot about this. And now, we want to open it up to questions. And so please, you can feel free to submit them in the chat. But again, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony and Martian. We do have a little bit of time for questions. I think, one of the interesting ones that came up that maybe is a little bit of a moot point, what you're saying about the treaty, but I think is interesting to think about is what would the impact of production caps actually be if by chance those were implemented? Yeah,
so this is so interesting. I'm glad someone asked this. I really don't think they'd be that big. I'm really kind of I think there's an interesting analogy to oil, right? Where right now, oil demand is flattening, and you see that oil demand from China in particular is really starting to slow and to flatten out. And that's been the driver of demand growth. And that's because there's been this underlying shift to electric vehicles, right? And I think you can see something similar happen in plastic demand, right? Because you have a lot of factors. First, we're already in an era of oversupply. And so I think, in a lot of like the EU, right, there's already countries or actors thinking about how do we curtail plastic supply, how do we shut down these certain facilities. But I think it doesn't take much scale up of recycling. You double recycling rates, you really, you basically eliminate plastic demand growth for, the next decade, right? That's something we forecast back in 2020, right? And so the amount of activity it takes on the circularity side, whether it's people switching to paper, whether it's plastic recycling, whether it's reusable plastics, it doesn't take a huge shift to actually eliminate demand growth, especially because I think a lot of companies are overestimating demand growth, right? They think it's going to be like 4% a year forever. And that's just, I think not realistic given the economy. So I'm not convinced the actual impact of production caps would be substantial, right? Now, of course, some of the proposed production caps have been like 20% of current global production. So like that
depends on the cap, right? Yeah.
Depends on the cap, obviously. But I think if you capped plastic production at today's levels, it's not clear to me that would be hugely impactful.
Yeah. I think one other question, and I know, Martian, this is something you've written, thought a lot about, is this question of waste infrastructure. You guys have touched on it a couple of times, and I know a lot in our previous research of the importance of building out the waste infrastructure in order to achieve any kind of recycling and waste management goals. what are some of the, what are the types of investments that are really going to be needed to achieve the goals of the plastic pact, right? Is it just kind of greater expansion of existing recycling facilities, or is there novel technology that's going to be needed to be deployed, and how could that be funded and rolled out?
Yeah, that's a good question, Mike. I think that it is very clear nowadays that recycling is not just the actual conversion of plastic waste to a new product itself, right? But it actually starts way before that, from collecting or preparation of feedstock and that. And if you kind of work backwards from recycling, I think one of the biggest areas that requires a lot of investment nowadays is in your feedstock management, or in other words, your waste sorting. And we really see a real life example today where plastic pyrolysis has always struggled with commercial scale up, but ExxonMobil is doing a pretty good job. And I think this is largely because they have invested in Cyclics, which is an expert in feedstock management, right? And because of this connector between the end of life of the plastic, where a consumer throws it out, and connecting this all the way to the recycling reactor itself, this connecting module there that is going to enable your recycling to happen.
All right. Well, I know we're running at or a bit over time, so I think we'll wrap up there for today. So thanks to Anthony and Martian for the presentation and discussion here, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. The slide presentation and recording will be sent out to all attendees by email. Pardon me. And after you leave the webinar, you will see a survey pop up about the presentation today. We really appreciate if you could take just a couple of minutes to fill in that short survey. We look at those responses very closely, and that really helps us to plan and improve on future webinars. And of course, check out the upcoming webinars that we have today, and come back for more in the future. But thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.